Liora, and thanks also Shelley for organizing this and for the invitation to attend.
Shelley, hi.
Hi. And thanks to Ariel for a really insightful piece. I was immediately, sorry, I'll try to get closer. So I was attracted to when I was invited to respond to this presentation before I actually knew what it was about, because of the kind of promise in the title. For those of us working here, from horror, we were very much engulfed in horror, but the promise of hope was an attraction. And I think, there was some sorrow also in your talk, but there was at least outlines to perhaps potential that we could perhaps draw from in this context as well. So what I'm planning to do in the few minutes at my disposal, I'll try to keep to the time limits, is to share some thoughts and perhaps analogies that came to mind while I was listening to you and reading the text that was shared with us, maybe some insights also. And these, I must say, are very much informed by my own experience. I think an experience that's common to many people in the room now. So part of it is my own experience as a legal practitioner, an international lawyer, but also as a person living and working deeply immersed in the current Israeli-Palestinian context, and immersed in this context in what is, I wrote down probably here, but I think I could scratch that word, the ugliest chapter in a long history of violence. And as a consequence of sort of approaching it from that perspective, while reading your reflections on the genealogy of this category of enforced disappearances, and also a little bit about its interrelationship with other categories, such as social disappearance, my thoughts quite naturally turned to this idea of migration of a category, in this case of enforced disappearances, and how what happens when these kinds of categories move from one context to another. And then, I suppose, as a next step, I started thinking about other categories. So this phenomenon of categories that evolved in a particular context being applied to this context is something that we're encountering more and more nowadays. Quite, I think, shockingly for many of us when you consider the nature of these categories. And so this is sort of the approach that I had here. So I suppose my talk is going to be a little bit about, not so much about the creation of categories as you spoke, but about the migration of categories, and maybe some thoughts about a new category. Although I'm not going to offer a new category, but maybe some thoughts about how that might be characterized. So in your talk and in the paper, you point out to all kinds of dilemmas and tensions and hesitations and questions that are generated when you place a diverse social phenomena into a legal category. So you have to take all these various elements and somehow fit them into a legal category. And in one way, I suppose that's a challenge that's true of law in general, of language in general. It requires us to apply a kind of general label to concrete items, to concrete events. And obviously every event, every item, everything is distinguished from every other thing. There's always differences there. So what we're trying to do is to fit a title, a label onto things that are distinct in some ways. And that's really where we lawyers earn our keep. A lot of what we do is to intervene in the space between a general abstract category and a specific and concrete reality. So that's general, that's something we're kind of used to, but I think this challenge becomes more pronounced when it comes to legal categories like enforced disappearances that emerged out of not only out of, but also in response to events and experiences rooted very much in a particular historical context, and not only a particular historical context, but one that left a painful mark. And so that exercise of moving that experience, the category that emerged from that elsewhere, is not simple, and we're encountering that, as I suggested, in a few ways in in this context. So all kinds of challenges and dilemmas and tensions when we think about legal categories and how they might or might not apply in this context. And there are probably many more that one could think of, but there are 4, I think, notable categories that are very much part of the discourse about what's happening here and now that I wanted to touch upon. One of them is indeed enforced disappearances. So I can say that at the IHL Center where I work, and actually also at the Public Committee Against Torture in Israel, where it was mentioned I'm part of the board, along with many other actors, we have been working, and this is not something that we would have expected to find ourselves doing in this context, to be honest, before the 7th of October. We have been working on enforced disappearances. You were talking about that category in relation to the Israeli hostages. There are very clear legal categories that apply to those, in particular hostages, but we were reflecting on this to our shock and shame, I suppose, in relation to people that are being detained by Israel. You mentioned people held in Israeli detention facilities. So that's one category. I might say a few more words about that in a moment. The second category, and that's been one that's been part of the discourse around this context for quite some time, but also, I mean, certainly my parents who, speaking about immigration, who immigrated or came here from apartheid South Africa when I was a child, did not expect that the label of apartheid would in some sense follow them to this context, but it has very much been a label that has been debated around this context. Many argue that Israel's conduct in all of the territory under its control, in a more radical view, or in the occupied Palestinian territories, amounts to apartheid. I'm not getting into that debate. I probably won't get into it at all now, but certainly not now. I'm still mapping out the categories. A third category, and that's one that I think is commanding more and more attention in discourse, is the category of ethnic cleansing. So, I mean, ethnic cleansing, like enforced disappearances, as a practice, it has a very long history, unfortunately. But as a kind of category that came into common usage, it sort of crystallized in the Bosnian Wars quite recently, in the 1990s. And so that's the kind of environment that it emerged from. But in this context, people have been, actually, I think there was just a ceremony earlier today here marking the Nakba. So for many Palestinians, the Nakba marks an event of ethnic cleansing. That's a very controversial kind of history. In this context, at least, it's controversial. But it was a historical kind of debate. Unfortunately, painfully, now we're having discussions about ethnic cleansing occurring in this context, not as a chapter in history, but as a prospect for the future, or an unfolding reality currently, at least on some views, occurring as we speak in Gaza, or contemplated in Gaza. You refer to him as your friend. He didn't help in that regard. President Trump, with all kinds of suggestions about people voluntarily leaving, that hasn't helped in that regard. And then finally, most disturbingly, most painfully, shockingly, genocide is a category that's being discussed in front of the International Court of Justice and elsewhere about what's happening in this context. Now, what Israel is doing to Palestinians is obviously not identical to what apartheid South Africa did to its black population. It's not the same as what various ethnic groups did to one another in the Yugoslav wars. Certainly not the same as the crimes that the Nazis perpetrated upon Jews and others. But while that is evident, it's not the same. What is less, at least I'm contending, self-evident, is that, and this is the subject of very heated debate, including before the International Court of Justice, as I mentioned, is whether the differences that exist between this context and these others is such that the categories, the labels, are irrelevant to this context. And even if one is convinced that they don't fit to this context, I think we should all be alarmed that we've come to a point where many serious observers find it plausible, many find it convincing, that Israel is in fact perpetrating enforced disappearances, apartheid, ethnic cleansing, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide, and it's doing all this simultaneously. So we might vehemently disagree with that conclusion, but I think we should be very much disturbed that we've come to a point where this is a debate that's taking place. Now, I'm not going to try to. I'm out of time. Were you suggesting, or okay? So I'll really sort of try to condense this. I'm not going to attempt to settle the debate about whether these various labels fit. But what I will say is that this debate can't simply be dismissed by saying or by pointing to differences in this context and those previous ones. I think the possibility of the fact that there's this kind of debate, the rationale behind this debate, all this requires, at the very least, very careful attention for all of us, and also a serious reckoning. Now, I had quite a few more things to say also about enforced displacement, but maybe that will come out in discussion.
Enforced disappearance, you have 2 minutes.
Okay. So I said I wouldn't get into the discussion about whether these various labels fit. But I think when it comes to enforced disappearances, the fit is easier, unfortunately, to establish than some of those other categories. Ariel usefully kind of distinguished some of the constitutive elements of enforced disappearance. And we've elaborated on that, my organization and others, in documents that we've published analyzing some of the policies. So this is a policy matter, not something that's happening because of individual decisions, showing that there's strong, serious grounds for concern that these elements have crystallized in this context. So there's deprivation of liberty, obviously, of thousands of Palestinians. There's state involvement, of course, in that. And then the questions are around the refusal to provide information on the deprivation of liberty itself, and that unfortunately has occurred. There are people in Gaza who don't know if their family members are buried under a building that's collapsed or languishing in an Israeli detention facility, or perhaps dead and buried somewhere. So there's deprivation of, there's information deprived about that, and then also about the state of the people who are being deprived of the liberty. You mentioned that I work for the International Committee of the Red Cross. One of the things that we used to do is visit every single person every Palestinian who was detained. The Red Cross hasn't visited any of those people since the beginning of the hostilities because they're not allowed to. And there are other reasons why there are limits on that, and also about the whereabouts of the disappeared persons. Eventually, in some cases, it came out. You mentioned that you can disappear for a period. Mm-hmm. So if you don't see a lawyer and you don't appear before a judge and there's no information released about your detention for 75 days, as the law here allowed it for various categories of detainees, that may very well amount to an enforcement. So I'll stop there for that, but we have a lot to be concerned about, let's just say. So I didn't get to the hope part, but maybe in the questions. Thanks a lot.